I never imagined my world could shatter so completely. Not until I saw my stepson standing in my bedroom doorway, his eyes filled with something I couldn't explain. It was supposed to be a normal evening, but the moment his hand brushed against mine, everything changed. My heart raced, not out of fear, but something far worse. I knew what I felt was wrong, yet I couldn't look away. Emily had always prided herself on being strong. At 19, she married her high school sweetheart, Daniel, believing they would build the perfect life together. He was charming, dependable, and made her feel safe, at least in the beginning. Their son, Ryan, was born a year later, and Emily's world revolved around him. She poured every ounce of love into their little family, convinced that nothing could tear them apart. But Daniel had other plans. Late nights at work turned into unexplained absences, and Emily began finding receipts for expensive dinners she hadn't attended. The final blow came when she caught him sneaking out of their home at midnight, suitcase in hand. She begged him to stay, pleaded for the sake of their child, but Daniel barely looked back as he walked out the door. Emily was left to pick up the pieces. She juggled 2 jobs to keep the house running and did her best to shield Ryan from the pain. Despite the struggles, he grew into a kind and protective young man, always looking out for her. Emily often joked that Ryan had been her rock, but deep down, she knew it was true. As the years passed, Emily's world revolved around routine. She worked, cooked, cleaned, and cared for Ryan. But as he grew older, things began to shift. At 18, Ryan had grown tall, broad-shouldered, and confident, with a maturity that sometimes made Emily forget how young he really was. He took over chores, fixed things around the house, and even helped with finances when Emily struggled. Their bond was unshakable. They weren't just mother and son. They were partners, best friends, and at times each other's only source of comfort. Yet, as Ryan stepped into adulthood, Emily began noticing subtle changes. How he lingered during their hugs, how his gaze would sometimes hold hers a little too long. She brushed it off, telling herself it was her imagination. But the night Ryan came into her room after her birthday party, everything shifted. It wasn't just the way he looked at her. It was the way her body responded. And no matter how hard she tried to push it aside, the feelings refused to fade. Emily tried to convince herself that what happened that night was nothing. A fleeting moment of confusion brought on by exhaustion and too much wine. But the memory lingered. She replayed it endlessly. The warmth of Ryan's arms, the way his breath tickled her neck, and the unfamiliar flutter in her chest that left her feeling exposed. The days that followed were painfully normal, yet Emily couldn't shake the tension building inside her. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. He carried on as if nothing had happened, helping with dishes, making coffee, and checking in on her like always. But it was the small things she began to notice. The way his gaze lingered just a second too long when she walked past in her robe. The casual touches, a hand resting on her lower back, his fingers brushing against hers when passing the remote, felt deliberate. Emily told herself it was harmless, that she was imagining things, but her body betrayed her. Her skin would flush, her pulse quicken, and she hated herself for it. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Emily found herself holding one of Ryan's shirts. She pressed it to her face, inhaling his scent before realizing what she was doing. Disgusted, she threw it into the basket and tried to push the thought away. But it was getting harder. Ryan started spending more time at home, skipping outings with friends to sit with her and watch movies. He'd stretch out on the couch, resting his head in her lap like he used to when he was younger. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Emily's hands trembled as she ran her fingers through his hair, acutely aware of how different he felt now, stronger, older. One night, after a particularly tense moment during a movie, Ryan caught her staring. "Mom? You okay?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Emily's throat tightened as she forced a smile. "Of course, honey. Just tired." But Ryan didn't look convinced. He leaned in closer, his hand brushing against her knee. "You sure? You seem different lately." Emily's heart pounded. "I'm fine," she insisted, standing abruptly to clear the dishes. But as she walked away, she felt his eyes on her, watching, studying, and the air in the room felt heavier. The breaking point came when Emily decided to take a long bath to clear her head. She locked the door, sank into the warm water, and tried to relax. But just as she began to unwind, there was a knock. "Mom? Are you okay?" Ryan's voice came through the door. "I'm fine, Ryan. Just taking a bath," she called back, hoping he'd go away. But he didn't. "You've been in there a while. I just wanted to check." Emily's stomach twisted. She told herself he was just being protective, like always, but her thoughts betrayed her. She pictured him standing outside the door, imagined his hand resting on the knob, and felt an ache she couldn't explain. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she heard Ryan's footsteps outside her door. They paused, then moved away. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but the tension wouldn't fade. Emily knew she had crossed an invisible line. Whether it was in her mind or reality, she couldn't tell. And that terrified her. Emily woke up the next morning, determined to shake off the thoughts that had been plaguing her. She avoided Ryan as much as she could, burying herself in chores and errands. But no matter how busy she kept herself, her mind wandered back to him, his touch, his scent, the way his voice lingered in her ears. It wasn't until that evening, when Ryan returned home early, that the tension boiled over. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he stepped in behind her. "Need help?" he asked, his voice soft and steady. She didn't turn around, keeping her focus on chopping vegetables. "I've got it, thanks." But Ryan didn't leave. Instead, he moved closer, standing just behind her. Emily froze as she felt his presence, his warmth radiating against her back. Her breath caught when his hand brushed against her hip as he reached for a knife on the counter. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't step away. Emily turned around abruptly, forcing a nervous laugh. "It's fine. You're always hovering, Ryan." He smiled, but there was something different in his eyes. "Maybe I just like being around you." Her stomach tightened. "Don't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. His voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it that made her knees feel weak. "You've been acting strange lately. Distant. Did I do something wrong?" Emily shook her head, backing up against the counter. "No, of course not. I have a lot on my mind." Ryan's hand brushed her arm, and she flinched, but not out of fear. It was something else entirely, something she hated herself for feeling. "You can talk to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know I'm here for you, right? Always." Emily swallowed hard, unable to hold his gaze. "I know." But when she tried to move past him, he didn't step aside. Instead, he reached out, gently cupping her face. Her breath hitched, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Ryan," she started, but he cut her off. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "I'd never hurt you." Emily's resolve crumbled. She didn't stop him when he leaned in, didn't stop herself when their lips brushed together. The kiss was hesitant at first, but when Ryan pressed closer, it deepened. Emily's hands found his shoulders, and she let herself sink into the moment, ignoring the voice in her head screaming that it was wrong. When they finally pulled apart, Emily's chest heaved. "We can't," she whispered, but her words lacked conviction. Ryan searched her eyes, his hand still resting against her cheek. "Tell me you don't feel it too." She couldn't. Instead, she turned away, pressing her palms against the counter to steady herself. "This is wrong." "Then why did you kiss me back?" Emily didn't have an answer. She couldn't explain the pull she felt, the way her body seemed to betray her at every turn. She fled the kitchen, locking herself in her bedroom and fighting back tears. But Ryan didn't let it go. Over the next few days, he found excuses to be close to her. Helping her with laundry, brushing past her in the hallway, lingering during movie nights. Every touch sent shivers down her spine, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop herself from craving more. One night, it all came crashing down. Emily was sitting on the couch, flipping through TV channels, when Ryan sat beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned back, resting his arm along the back of the couch. But then his fingers brushed her shoulder, and Emily froze. "Ryan, don't," she said, but her voice wavered. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Because it's wrong." "Does it feel wrong?" Emily's breath caught as he leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. She should have pushed him away, but instead, she turned to face him. Their eyes locked, and before she could think, he kissed her again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was hungry and desperate, as though they had both been holding back for far too long. Emily's hands found his hair, pulling him closer, and Ryan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her into his lap. When they finally broke apart, Emily felt dizzy, both from the kiss and the weight of what they had just done. "This can't happen again," she whispered, but Ryan shook his head. "I don't believe you." And deep down, neither did she. Emily couldn't sleep that night. Her mind raced with guilt, shame, and a longing she couldn't push away. She kept replaying the kiss, the way Ryan had held her, the heat that surged through her veins as though it had awakened something long buried. She told herself it had to stop. Tomorrow, she'd sit him down and set boundaries. She'd explain that it was a mistake, that it could never happen again. But when morning came, her resolve crumbled the moment she saw him. Ryan was in the kitchen, shirtless, making coffee. The sight of him, broad shoulders, toned muscles, and that casual confidence stole her breath. He turned and smiled like nothing had changed, like they hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm. Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. "Morning," she managed, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, and she took a step back, bumping into the counter. "Ryan, we need to talk." His expression shifted, darkening with concern. "What's wrong?" "Last night, it can't happen again." He didn't move. "Why not?" "Because it's wrong," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Ryan reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then why does it feel so right?" Emily's breath hitched as he leaned in, but this time, she forced herself to pull away. "Stop," she snapped, her voice louder than she intended. Ryan froze, his eyes wide with hurt. "I'm sorry," he whispered, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, Winnie's voice called from upstairs. "Mom? Where's my backpack?" The tension shattered, and Emily clung to the distraction. "I'll be right there," she called back, avoiding Ryan's gaze as she hurried past him. But the moment didn't fade. It lingered, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. And when Emily returned later that evening, it finally did. Ryan was waiting for her in the living room. The house was quiet. Winnie was asleep, and Emily's heart sank as soon as she saw the look in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. Emily's pulse quickened. "Ryan, I already told you." "No, Mom," he interrupted, stepping closer. "You're lying to yourself. I see it. I feel it." She tried to back away, but he caught her hand, holding it tightly. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted. "About us?" Tears filled Emily's eyes. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." His voice broke. "You're the only person who's ever been there for me. The only one who's ever made me feel safe, loved. Don't tell me you don't feel it too." Emily's resolve crumbled under the weight of his words. She knew it was wrong. Everything about it screamed that it was wrong, but she couldn't deny the way he made her feel. Protected. Desired. Alive. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Ryan stepped closer, his hand brushing her cheek. "You don't have to be scared. I'll never hurt you." And then it happened. She didn't stop him when he kissed her. Didn't pull away when his hands slid down her sides, pulling her closer. She let herself give in, surrendering to the moment, the heat, the desperation. They didn't make it to the bedroom. It happened right there on the couch, frantic and messy and completely forbidden. And afterward, as they lay tangled together, Emily felt equal parts shame and relief. But the relief didn't last. The next morning, Emily woke up to find Ryan already awake, pacing the living room. He looked up when she entered, guilt etched across his face. "This can't keep happening," he said. "I know," Emily replied, but neither of them believed it. Days turned into weeks, and the secrecy only made it worse. They stole moments when Winnie was asleep, shared lingering touches when no one was looking, and whispered promises they knew they couldn't keep. But secrets never stay buried for long. One evening, while Emily was cooking dinner, Winnie walked in and froze. She looked between her mother and Ryan, too close, too intimate, and her innocent face darkened with suspicion. "Why are you always together?" she asked, her voice sharp. Emily's heart dropped. "What do you mean?" "You're acting weird," Winnie pressed. "Both of you." Emily forced a laugh. "Don't be silly. We're just close, that's all." But the look in Winnie's eyes said she didn't believe it. From that moment, the tension only grew. Emily became paranoid, jumping at every sound, every knock at the door. She was terrified someone would find out, that their carefully constructed world would come crashing down. And then it did. One night, Emily woke to find Ryan sitting at the edge of her bed. She sat up, pulling the blanket around herself. "Ryan, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. "I can't lose you," he whispered. "You won't," she promised, but the words felt hollow. Because deep down, she knew this couldn't last. The guilt, the shame, the fear, it was eating away at her and there was no escape. But as Ryan leaned in and kissed her again, all those thoughts melted away. For just a moment, she let herself forget. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and stolen moments. Emily couldn't focus. She kept replaying everything in her mind, Ryan's touch, his words, the way he made her feel wanted. But the shame was suffocating. Every time she looked at Winnie, her chest tightened with fear. What if she figured it out? What if someone else did? Emily tried to pull away, to create distance between herself and Ryan, but he wouldn't let her. "You're all I have," he said one night, his voice breaking. "You can't push me away." Her resolve wavered. She couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes, couldn't stand the thought of losing the one person who made her feel alive. But the deeper they sank, the harder it became to keep their secret buried. The first cracks appeared when Winnie started asking questions. "Why does Ryan look at you like that?" she asked one night at dinner, her tone sharp and curious. Emily's heart pounded. "What do you mean? Like, you're not just his mom." Emily forced a laugh, brushing it off. "Don't be silly." But the tension in the room was undeniable. Ryan barely touched his food, and Winnie's eyes lingered on him longer than usual. Emily could feel her daughter's suspicion growing, and it terrified her. Then came the night when everything fell apart. Emily had just finished putting Winnie to bed when Ryan came into her room. His eyes were dark, intense, and before she could protest, he pulled her into his arms. "Ryan, stop," she whispered, but her voice was weak. "You don't mean that," he said, his lips brushing against her neck. And she didn't. She couldn't resist him, didn't want to. But as their passion reignited, the door creaked open. "Mom!" Winnie's voice froze them both. Emily pushed Ryan away, her face pale as she turned to see her daughter standing in the doorway, wide-eyed and trembling. "Winnie!" Emily stammered, scrambling to pull her robe closed. Winnie's face crumpled. "What are you doing?" "It's not what it looks like," Emily tried to explain, but the words felt hollow. Winnie's eyes filled with tears. "I trusted you. How could you?" She turned and ran, leaving Emily frozen in place. Ryan reached for her, but Emily shoved him away. "You need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "What?" His face twisted in panic. "No. We can fix this." "No, we can't," she snapped. "It's over, Ryan. It has to be." But the damage was already done. Winnie refused to speak to Emily, locking herself in her room and ignoring every attempt to make things right. The guilt consumed Emily, but the worst part was the look in Ryan's eyes, a mixture of heartbreak and desperation. "I need you," he whispered one night, standing at her bedroom door. Emily's voice cracked. "I can't." "But I love you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "And that's exactly why we have to stop," she replied, her own tears falling freely. Ryan left that night, slamming the door behind him, and Emily collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. In the days that followed, Emily tried to pick up the pieces, but everything felt broken. Winnie barely spoke to her, and Ryan was gone, leaving behind an emptiness she couldn't fill. She spent hours staring at her phone, debating whether to call him, to beg him to come back. But she knew it wouldn't fix anything. What they had done could never be undone. Emily started seeing a therapist, desperate to understand how she had let it go so far. She poured out her guilt, her shame, and her longing, but no matter how much she talked, the ache didn't fade. Winnie eventually started to heal, though the trust between them was shattered. Emily worked tirelessly to rebuild it, promising herself she'd never let her daughter down again. But Ryan? He was gone. He left without a word, and Emily knew it was for the best. Still, every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, felt his touch, his warmth, and wondered if she'd ever be whole again. Emily sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the silence pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. It had been weeks since Ryan left, but his absence lingered in every corner of the house. She half expected to hear his footsteps on the stairs, or his voice calling out from the kitchen. But all she heard was silence, and the echoes of her own regret. She had tried to move forward, tried to focus on Winnie and repair the damage she had caused. But the guilt was relentless, gnawing at her no matter how hard she worked to put on a brave face. Winnie still looked at her with suspicion, and Emily knew it would take time, maybe years, to earn back her daughter's trust. The hardest part wasn't the guilt or the shame, though. It was the emptiness. For all the ways she had justified what happened with Ryan, she knew deep down it had been born out of loneliness. She had spent so long feeling invisible, unwanted, and discarded that when Ryan made her feel seen again, she had clung to it like a lifeline. But it hadn't been love, not really. It had been desperation wrapped in comfort, a dangerous illusion that offered relief from the pain she had buried for years. And now she was paying the price. Emily stared at the picture on the mantel, a photo of her and Ryan at his high school graduation. He had his arm around her, his smile bright and full of promise. She had been so proud of him, so certain he'd grow into the kind of man who could handle anything life threw his way. But she had failed him. She had let her own weakness drag them both into something neither of them could control. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered to the empty room, "I'm sorry." Therapy had helped her see the truth. She hadn't just hurt herself, she had hurt Ryan too. She had blurred the lines between protector and dependent, leaving him lost and confused about what love was supposed to look like. She had turned him into her safety net, and when the boundaries broke, so did everything else. For the first time, Emily let herself imagine what Ryan must have felt, how his need to protect her had twisted into something else, something forbidden, and how her own vulnerability had fed into it. But now it was time to let him go. She picked up her phone and typed out a message she had written and rewritten a dozen times. Ryan, I'm sorry. For everything. You didn't deserve to carry my pain. You deserved a mother who was strong enough to protect you, not one who made you feel like you had to protect her. I hope you can forgive me someday. I hope you find the happiness you deserve. She hesitated before hitting send, but finally, her finger pressed the button. It was done. Emily knew it wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a start, a step toward facing the consequences and accepting responsibility for her mistakes. When Winnie came downstairs later that evening, Emily looked up and smiled. Do you want to go for ice cream? She asked, her voice tentative. Winnie hesitated but then nodded. Okay. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they walked out the door, Emily felt the weight of her guilt begin to lift, just slightly. She wasn't sure if she'd ever forgive herself completely, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let her past define her future. Because no matter how far she had fallen, she still had the power to stand back up. And this time, she was determined to do it the right way. Thank you for listening to Emily's story. A story about love, loneliness, and the devastating consequences of crossing forbidden boundaries. What would you have done in her situation? Could you forgive, or is some damage too deep to repair? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more shocking stories that challenge emotions and test boundaries.